That decision wasn't simply an investment. It was an act of faith in the ingenuity and spirit of this nation.
A hush fell over Aldenmore Palace the moment Crown Prince Julian stepped forward with a tone the kingdom hadn't heard from him in years, measured, heavy, and unmistakably final. His announcement about Duchess Isabel wasn't just unexpected. It carried a weight that instantly tightened the atmosphere across the entire royal household. Advisors paused mid-sentence. Reporters scrambled for their notebooks. Even longtime courtiers admitted they had never seen Julian this resolute. So what pushed the future king to make such a difficult declaration? And why does it run so much deeper than anyone imagined? For the first time in the modern history of the Alden monarchy, the heir to the throne had openly and publicly distanced himself from a member of the family who still carried royal rank. But the power of Julian's statement wasn't only in what he said. It was in how he said it. His voice was calm, level, and unshakably cold. There were no leaked memos this time, no anonymous murmurs from sources close to the palace. This was Julian himself, standing before the cameras, in the wake of King Alaric quietly transferring full control of the palace's crisis communications to Julian and his wife, Princess Charlotte. Insiders would later describe that transfer of authority as the true beginning of a new chapter for the crown. With King Alaric managing his own health difficulties and public confidence in the palace's old, reactive style of communication steadily eroding, the shift wasn't just ceremonial. It was strategic. It was, in the words of one longtime aide, about survival. 2 nights before Julian's declaration, King Alaric had signed a private directive at his countryside residence, a document his staff quietly nicknamed the Autumn Mandate. Under its terms, Princess Charlotte would take charge of managing the fallout from Isabel's renewed presence in the press. Old letters resurfacing, fresh interviews, a noticeably more combative tone from her side of the Atlantic. But the same directive handed Julian something else entirely: the role of being the singular voice of the family whenever the monarchy needed to project strength and certainty. And on a gray morning in early autumn, Julian delivered exactly that. Within hours of his remarks, Isabel's media apparatus on the West Coast came alive, pushing familiar narratives, claims of institutional bullying, emotional pressure, favoritism toward Charlotte, unfair treatment from the king himself. But after years of declining to respond publicly to Isabel's characterizations of the family, Julian did something almost no one expected. He answered her directly, formally, and without softening a single word. Standing before a small group of reporters in the palace's long gallery, he said plainly that no member of his family had ever bullied Isabel, and that no one had ever been favored over her at her expense. What had happened, he said, was the result of her own choices and her own repeated attempts to undermine the institution from the outside. Then he went further than even the most seasoned royal correspondents in the room expected. He referenced what he called deliberate media manipulation, coordinated placements in the press designed, in his words, to damage Charlotte's public standing. He called them intentional, not misunderstandings. Multiple people close to the palace later confirmed that Julian was referring to a string of commission pieces from late in the previous year, articles that painted Charlotte's popularity as something calculated and framed Alaric as threatened by Isabel's international profile. Those same outlets, notably, quietly took the stories down in the weeks that followed. Julian also disclosed something the public had never heard before: that Isabel had been in private contact with Duchess Margaret, a long-estranged royal aunt with her own history of grievances against the family, and that the two had, according to Julian, worked together to apply pressure on Charlotte during one of the most difficult periods of her recovery from a serious illness the year before. An aide later tried to soften the revelation, explaining that Margaret had been emotionally vulnerable and easily drawn in during that period. But Julian's underlying message was unmistakable. Isabel wasn't simply criticizing the monarchy from a distance anymore. She was actively building alliances against it from within. Then, in a moment that stunned a room into silence, Julian invoked the name of Prince Leopold, the most disgraced senior royal in the family's recent history, long stripped of his duties after scandal. Transparency, Julian said, was not optional. It was required. The same standard applied to Leopold, he said, would apply equally to Isabel. for a future king to place his sister-in-law in the same sentence as Leopold was no accident. It was a deliberate signal that the crown intended to protect no one, not even someone who still carried a royal title through marriage. But the moment that seemed to freeze the entire room was Julian's closing remarks about his own brother, Prince Edmund, Isabel's husband. He stated plainly that he would not answer media questions about the Duke going forward, nor would he engage with any commentary coming out of entertainment circles about him. Any future contact between the brothers, he said, would not happen through public channels. Julian, by every account in the room that day, was finished defending, finished explaining, finished waiting. Then came a line that seemed to end whatever remained of the brothers' relationship in the public eye. The crown, he said, could not be dragged into every storm created outside its walls. It was widely understood as a direct reference to a string of live-streamed grievances, public interviews, and entertainment industry storytelling that Edmund and Isabel had leaned into over the previous several years. In an unusual break from royal tradition, Julian also spoke directly about the couple's 2 young children, describing them as innocent and deserving of stability, dignity, and a childhood free from public conflict. If protecting them required some form of intervention, he said, the institution would not hesitate. Senior aides were quick to clarify afterward that this was not a threat regarding custody. It was, in their words, a warning. The monarchy, they said, would not allow the children to become instruments in a media battle. Privately, someone close to Julian described him as heartbroken over the situation, saying the children were growing up inside a noise chamber built entirely by their parents' choices. Within hours, public sentiment across Aldenmore shifted dramatically in Julian's favor. Talk shows on the other side of the Atlantic, by contrast, erupted with criticism. Polling in the days that followed showed a significant majority of the domestic public supporting Julian's position, while approval for Edmund and Isabel fell to some of its lowest levels in years. But inside the palace itself, there was no sense of celebration, only quiet resolve. Because, as it turned out, this was only the opening chapter. Roughly 2 weeks before Julian's public statement, during a closed-door meeting with a small circle of the palace's most senior advisors, Julian reportedly said the sentence that set the entire chain of events into motion, that the family could no longer afford to remain passive in the face of what he called deliberate sabotage. What followed was, by the palace's own internal reckoning, the most serious communications separation plan activated against a living member of the royal family in nearly a century. The spark, according to those familiar with the timeline, came when a batch of private messages attributed to Isabel, allegedly written over roughly 2 years, surfaced unexpectedly in late September. The messages reportedly went well beyond complaints about emotional distance from King Alaric during her pregnancies. They also suggested, according to palace officials, that Alaric had deliberately helped elevate Charlotte's public image while sidelining Isabel. Further complicating matters, the leaks suggested Isabel had reached out to media contacts with ties to a major streaming platform, with one message reportedly reading along the lines of, if the family wouldn't protect her, the story would have to do it instead. Within a day of the leak surfacing, senior palace figures, led by a longtime head of sovereign affairs, convened with legal counsel and security consultants. Their conclusion was blunt. Isabel was no longer viewed simply as an unconventional duchess pushing back against tradition. She was now regarded internally as an active communications risk to the crown itself. Soon after, in a sealed directive palace staff referred to internally by a case number, King Alaric handed full authority over public crisis management to Julian and Charlotte. The decision meant 2 things. Julian would become the only royal voice permitted to speak publicly about matters involving Edmund and Isabel. Charlotte would take charge of shaping the broader narrative and managing how the family's image was presented going forward. One insider described the moment as Alaric's last real opportunity to reset the family's public standing, a signal that the palace wanted to stop reacting to crises and start controlling the story itself. A former communications chief for the family put it more simply. Julian wasn't just solving a problem. He was drawing a new line for what the modern monarchy would and wouldn't tolerate. Behind closed doors, Julian had reportedly absorbed years of public criticism from Isabel's camp without responding. But according to those close to him, the true breaking point wasn't anything Isabel herself had said. It was Edmund's silence. After repeated public accusations from Isabel involving claims of prejudice and emotional cruelty within the family, Edmund reportedly said nothing publicly, while privately continuing to stand behind her account. Julian is said to have reached out to his brother directly in early October with a pointed message that Edmund knew the truth, that he had lived it, that Charlotte had never treated anyone with cruelty. So why wouldn't he say so? Edmund's reported reply, relayed by a palace aide, was telling, that speaking the truth, in his view, would cost him everything he had left. For Julian, that was reportedly the moment the relationship shifted from patience to open confrontation. As one royal watcher close to the family described it, Julian stopped trying to protect his brother's version of events and started protecting the institution instead. One of the most delicate parts of the entire episode centered on the two children. During his public remarks, Julian was careful to insist that the crown would never strip them of their rights or their dignity. But he also delivered a line that caught nearly everyone off guard, that if continued silence risked harming the children's emotional well-being, then that silence needed to end. Sources close to the family later confirmed that palace lawyers had quietly explored what options might exist to protect the children if the public disputes between their parents and the institution became too volatile. No formal action was ultimately taken, but the message sent to Edmund and Isabel was unmistakable. The children were not to be treated as leverage. Charlotte reportedly told a senior aide privately that the family would not allow the children to become characters in a story written for an audience an ocean away. Meanwhile, roughly 72 hours after Julian's statement, a new storm began building. Not from Aldermore, but from the hillside estates of Isabel and Edmund's adopted home abroad. In a tightly coordinated media push, outlets across two major entertainment capitals ran nearly simultaneous stories, under headlines suggesting Isabel was finally breaking her silence. She herself did not appear publicly, not yet. It had the hallmarks of a carefully staged soft launch, designed to shape the narrative without her stepping fully into the spotlight. Industry sources described the approach as following a familiar celebrity crisis playbook: deflect, reframe, humanize, and ultimately monetize. Early messaging emphasized her sense of never having been fully accepted by the family and hinted at unspecified emotional hardship during her second pregnancy. A later wave of coverage pivoted toward reinvention, new business ventures, a forthcoming book, a possible television project centered on healing generational trauma. The underlying message was clear. She didn't need the crown. She was building something of her own. A third wave of coverage anchored everything in the children, with a friend quoted as saying that all Isabel wanted was to raise her family in peace, and that when the institution came after her, her instinct, like any parents, was to protect them. Within a day and a half, the palace issued an unusually direct response, rejecting what it called an attempt to reframe a pattern of deliberate provocation as victimhood, and stating it would not engage further with speculative content promoted for commercial gain. But the response didn't stop at a written statement. Julian reportedly directed legal counsel to begin preliminary steps toward reviewing Isabel and Edmund's remaining royal titles, a highly confidential process sent for review at the highest levels. The request, according to those familiar with it, sought to formally withdraw royal recognition, instruct embassies abroad not to treat the couple as working members of the family, and freeze remaining ceremonial and property entitlements. This wasn't simply royal displeasure. It was, by every account, a full and deliberate institutional separation. Reaction outside the palace was mixed. Entertainment executives privately acknowledged a growing fatigue among audiences around the ongoing saga. One veteran industry dealmaker who had worked with Isabel's team in the past remarked that there was only so many times a story could return to the same well before it stopped drawing sympathy, that the drama might sell headlines in the short term, but was steadily eroding long-term trust. Others were blunter still, noting that Julian carried the weight of an entire global institution behind him, while Isabel had little more than a social media following and a handful of sympathetic interviews. No real comparison in terms of institutional gravity. Still, not everyone turned away. A major publisher reportedly fast-tracked an upcoming memoir project, and a production company reopened talks for a limited series built around her account of royal life. The media contest, in other words, was far from over. Back in Aldenmore, neither King Alaric nor Princess Charlotte made any public comment in the immediate aftermath. A silence palace officials described as entirely deliberate. Alaric, they confirmed, had formally authorized Julian to act on the crown's behalf in all matters involving Edmund and Isabel going forward. Charlotte, for her part, returned to public duties with a composure that many observers found almost more powerful than words. Just days after the entertainment world leaks broke, she appeared at a children's hospital wing opening, her presence calm and unmistakably steady. Royal commentators noted small, deliberate details in her appearance. Nothing flashy, nothing defensive, simply consistency. At one point, a young patient asked if she was okay, clearly picking up on the surrounding media noise. Her answer, that she was very well, and that everyone has to be strong sometimes, was widely replayed as a quiet rebuttal to the narrative being pushed from abroad. Yet the palace's sharpest signal, according to insiders, wasn't ultimately aimed at Isabel at all. It was aimed at Edmund. In a private briefing that later found its way into print, a senior advisor summarized Julian's position bluntly, that the family could accept grief, could accept differences, but could not accept betrayal, not after everything they had already endured together. In a final message relayed to senior staff, Julian reportedly made his position unmistakably clear. Edmund was still his brother, but he would not allow the family name to be used while it was actively being turned into a weapon against the institution. That chapter, he said, was closed. Insiders now describe this as Edmund's last real opportunity to change course. That continuing down the same path risked the loss of any remaining official recognition, ceremonial privileges, and future involvement in family life altogether. As one aide close to the situation put it, Edmund would eventually have to choose between the ongoing drama and his place in the family's future. As Julian delivered what many considered one of the most direct rebukes in the modern history of the Alden monarchy, attention naturally turned to Charlotte, who had quietly stepped into a role of moral steadiness once associated with the matriarchs of generations past. She did it, notably, without ever raising her voice publicly. Her first appearance following Julian's declaration was subtle in every detail. An understated gown, no elaborate styling, nothing designed to draw attention away from the substance of the moment. The message read clearly to those watching closely: composure, restraint, continuity. Despite years of comparison narratives and now direct public criticism from abroad, Charlotte's demeanor remained steady, warm, and precise. One reporter covering the event noted that the atmosphere in the room seemed to settle the moment she arrived, not because she was distant, but because her presence brought a sense of calm clarity that had been missing from the broader story for months. Those close to the family acknowledged that the preceding months had taken a real toll on Charlotte, balancing her children, supporting Alaric through his own health challenges, and carrying a public schedule far heavier than usual, with little space left for anything resembling rest. When asked privately about accusations of favoritism and mistreatment within the household, Charlotte reportedly offered a response that surprised even veteran staff, that she forgave Isabel, but would not carry the weight of her pain as though it were her own fault. It read less like a denial and more like a quiet refusal to be drawn into an emotional narrative she hadn't authored. It captured, in many ways, exactly the tone Julian and Charlotte seemed determined to set going forward: direct without cruelty, firm without spectacle, and above all, grounded in duty rather than distraction.